Welcome to episode 233, Protecting Older Adults, Recognizing and Responding to Elder Abuse, featuring Penny Jacobo, licensed clinical social worker. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical, learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I am really looking forward to this conversation today about elder abuse. I feel like this is one of those conversations that we don't talk about enough, and goodness knows the increase in the number of people in their older years in the United States, that population is growing. So this is an issue that's coming up more and more. And I want to introduce you to Penny Jacobo. She's a licensed clinical social worker. She has been working with adult protective services for over a decade, and this is her jam. She loves working with older adults, and I am so happy to have her here today. Please, Penny, thank you. And why don't you tell our listeners a bit about you and about your background?
Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Penny Jacobo. As Beth mentioned, I'm an LCSW, and I have been working with older adults for the majority of my professional life. I love working with adult protective services. There is something new every day. No 2 days are the same. And this is an area that is rapidly growing. And just as the population is growing, this is an area that unfortunately we are going to see more and more of, with more people who are vulnerable and other people who are, targeting that and just taking advantage of those vulnerabilities. I did graduate in 2012 with my MSW. I worked for a year or so in community mental health, working with adults who have serious mental illness. And then I ended up back in the older population. So that's really where my heart is. And I've been there ever since.
I'm looking forward to hearing from you some of the realities of elder abuse and where we might be missing it clinically and how to better provide support. Why don't we start, Penny, by just explaining what constitutes elder abuse and having you break down the most common different kinds?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are different types of abuse when we're talking about elder abuse. And it's almost the same as with children. However, there is an extra component of financial abuse. So we have physical abuse, which is pretty self-explanatory. That also includes sexual abuse. We have neglect. We have isolation and abandonment. We have um, financial abuse, as I mentioned, and that can look like a lot of different things, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But we also, in older adults, we have self-neglect, which is something that you don't see with children. And because we're dealing with adults, it can get a little bit tricky. In adult protective services, we get a lot of, I think the majority of our referrals are allegations of either financial abuse or self-neglect. Those are really our two most common ones, at least here in California, in Southern California. So financial abuse, as I mentioned, can look like a lot of different things. It can basically be as easy as stealing money from someone's wallet, or it can be very complex real estate transactions that are done without that person's knowledge or consent. And it does happen more often when people are older and start to lose their cognitive ability. So maybe they're not understanding what they're signing. And this is where people's individual vulnerabilities come in. So if someone is having a lot of difficulty with their hearing, right? So as we get older, our hearing starts to go down. So if they're not understanding what it is that the person is explaining to them, they're not understanding what they're signing, but they go ahead and sign anyway because they feel pressured to do so, that can be financial abuse. So it can be very simple or very complex. We've seen a lot of changes in wills, trusts, adding beneficiaries to bank accounts, or just completely taking over bank accounts. So it's very easy for somebody to be added onto an older adult's bank account and just pretty much take over under the guise of, well, I'm the caregiver. I'm just helping them make sure that their bills are paid, which can be the truth. Sometimes people do need help with paying their bills. However, when that money starts to be used for anything other than the older adult's benefit, that's really where the problem comes in. And in adult protective services, that's really what we investigate. So we try to follow the money as much as possible. Where did the money go? What was it being used for? So, for example, if somebody takes out $20,000, that could absolutely seem like financial abuse. However, with a little bit more digging, if that money was used for really badly needed repairs on that person's house that they're currently living in, then it wouldn't be. So that's really where that distinction comes in. What is the money being used for? So that's just one type of abuse.
Where's the dividing line? And how is that navigated when someone is right up against that line but hasn't crossed it from a legal perspective?
Right. So when we're talking about elder abuse, in California, there was actually a recent change where an older adult is considered anyone who is 60 years old and older. It varies across states. And also, it varies within states as far as criminal issues. So, for example, I could be investigating elder abuse for somebody who's 60 or 61, but if I try to send that over to law enforcement for them to investigate as elder abuse, they're not going to take it because their statute is 65 and older. So it really varies across states, across jurisdictions. And the best thing to do is just look it up, contact your local adult protective services agency. And the other thing to consider is that even though that person might not be 60 or above, or they might not meet that threshold, if they have some sort of disability that makes it difficult for them to carry out their activities of daily living, even if it's, well, this person can't get to the grocery store and purchase their own groceries because they have some cognitive decline, or they have a traumatic brain injury that makes it really difficult for them to dress themselves, they could still be considered dependent adults. So my suggestion is whenever there is a question of, is abuse actually happening? Is neglect happening? Just go ahead and report. It's not the reporter's job to figure out whether that person meets criteria or not. As long as there is reasonable suspicion to suspect that something is going on, I would say just be safe and go ahead and make that report.
Thank you. I really appreciate you bringing up that point because I think one of the things I see come up most commonly with clinicians is, do I report or not? And at some point, these lines are drawn, as you said, like different lines drawn in the sand in different states, and knowing what's mandated in your jurisdiction. But I appreciate what you're saying, which is just because it's not covered necessarily under elder abuse laws, may be covered under other laws that could help protect this person.
And adult protective services throughout the states do cover dependent adults as well. So people who have cognitive limitations, they might have a mental illness that doesn't allow them to be able to take care of themselves. That is also covered. So we're talking about not just older adults, but adults who are just vulnerable for whatever reason.
Thank you. And I also appreciate your point and would like to spend a little bit more time about how it's not the clinician's responsibility to investigate and make decisions. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because I think this, again, is one of those issues that comes up with clinicians of how far do I have to go to verify the person's date or date of birth, or to, you know, make sure that they did actually write that check or whatever it is.
Yeah. Again, I think it goes back to reasonable suspicion. So, anytime that a clinician is working with someone who reports anything even remotely close to abuse, neglect, anything like that, I think the best thing is to just go ahead and report and let us figure out whether to take it or not. It's really easy to take a look at a report and say, oh, this doesn't meet criteria, and to just, thank the reporter and put it to the side or explain why it didn't meet criteria. Um, the clinician is not required to confirm that something actually happened. Reasonable suspicion pretty much just means that, using your critical thinking skills, do you think that there might be something there? And that's pretty much what it comes down to. If you have someone that has, a history of um, either delusions or anything like that, where you think, well, they're reporting because they're reporting to me that aliens are coming down. And this is actually something that I had happen, that the aliens are coming down from their attic and stealing their food at night, right? If it's something like that, that's probably not something that is occurring. And without any other reports or any other evidence, that might be a situation that be okay not to report, right? Because there isn't that reasonable suspicion element. However, if that person is saying, well, my neighbor comes over every other day, and I find that every time they come over, medication goes missing. That is reasonable suspicion, right? So, is it based in reality? Is it something that more or less makes sense to the clinician? And if so, just go ahead and report.
Thank you. Going back to the different kinds of elder abuse, you talked a little bit about financial abuse. We see these things come up in the news where people have signed up for 8 different cell phone contracts, where they get an email saying, oh, I need you to send $2,000 in order to support your nephew, yada, yada, yada. That's spam. Financial abuse could manifest in so many different ways. Like you said, like literally taking money out of somebody's wallet. What are some of the other markers that clinicians should be looking for? And kind of what's your process? Or not necessarily what's your process because you are APS, but what do you think a clinician's process ought to be to suss out? Oh, this might be going on.
So, one of the things that is very common right now and has been for a while are scams, right? So, there are so many different types of scams out there. And unfortunately, they're getting more and more sophisticated every day. I feel like we're always trying to play catch up with what's the new scam. And now they're using AI to sound like other people. So, it can be really difficult to figure out, what is actually happening. But again, that's not the clinician's, it's not their job to figure it out. I think the things to look for are changes in behavior when it comes to the older adults and their finances. So, for example, if you have a client who has always been very thrifty, they are very careful with their money, and all of a sudden they start telling you about this great investment opportunity, and they are now sending money overseas, that is a really big change in behavior for them. So I would start asking a little bit more follow up questions about that. So, for example, how did you hear about this? Did somebody contact you or did you contact somebody? A lot of the times, scammers will contact older adults knowing that they are more vulnerable. The other tactic that scammers use is making the older adult very afraid to talk to anyone. So they might actually be hesitant to open up and speak to their therapist about this because they've been coached not to. Um, they are also very good at making them wary of other people. So, for example, a scammer can say, I've got this really good investment opportunity for you, but your financial advisor or your banker. They're in on, whatever the conspiracy is. So fill in the blank. So you can't talk to them about it. And this is a timely manner. So you have to act right away. Right. So they are very specific tactics that are used by scammers to not allow that person to really think about what's going on and to realize that it's a scam. Um, so being very secretive is a huge red flag, very secretive about what's going on, or just giving you like little tidbits about, well, I'm waiting for something really big to happen, or I'm going to be coming into a lot of money very soon, right? I would ask some follow-up questions about that. If you ever hear about somebody who has entered a lottery in a different country, that is absolutely a scam. People that live in other countries are not actually allowed to enter lotteries. So that is a huge scam. But I think the biggest thing to really be on the lookout for is that change in behavior. And that kind of goes across the board with any type of abuse, not just the financial abuse.
I appreciate that point you just made about any type of abuse, and I want to get to that. To jump back to what you'd said about scams, knowing that they are so common this day and age, let's say that a clinician suspects that an older adult has been victimized by a scam. How does APS respond to that, given that as every day passes, as you said, scams become more and more elaborate, more difficult to track? Like, what's the intervention by APS in situations like that?
So, with scams, it's a very, very difficult to recover money. For the most part, once that money has left, it's gone, which is really unfortunate. And the best thing that we can do as APS is to go out and educate that person to prevent it from happening again. And once it does happen, it is a lot more common for other scammers to contact them. So usually what we found happens is that if somebody falls for a scam, their contact information is then sold to other scammers who then start contacting them more and more. So just because they've stopped engaging with one scammer doesn't mean that they're not at risk anymore. So just making sure that they are aware of the tactics that scammers use, making sure that they understand that it's okay and it's encouraged to actually take a second, talk to their family members, talk to loved ones or people that they trust, and verify that what the scammer is saying is true or not.
Outside of scams, looking at the more direct, immediate community examples of abuse. So, a family member, a neighbor, um, uh, a real person, we'll say a tangible person that is interacting, whether that's a person either pretending to be or is actually a worker saying you need this much work, it's going to cost this much, and the estimate is obscene compared to what actually needs to be done. How are those issues addressed? Are they way more common than we think they are? Like, let's talk about that on the financial abuse level of things.
Absolutely. So, again, going back to any type of abuse, the vast majority of people who perpetrate abuse are family members. Children, so adult children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, not so much for financial abuse, but even spouses make up a solid number of abusers. And one of the things that we see quite often with financial abuse is a new caregiver that steps into the picture out of nowhere. And again, a lot of people who are targeting older adults or disabled adults, they know what they're doing. They specifically go out and they find people who are vulnerable, and they might say things like, "Oh, I can be your caregiver. Um, and I can help you with everything. You just need to add me to your bank account, or you need to change your beneficiaries on your accounts or your wills or your trust or whatever it is that that person has. And then they slowly start to take over. So there's something called undue influence. And undue influence is basically what a lot of these people do to gain the older dependent adult's trust and make them solely dependent on that particular person. So if a clinician starts seeing that relationships with other family members or friends are kind of being cut off, and that person is more and more dependent on this new caregiver or on this new best friend, that's a huge red flag. Somebody who is truly there to help and to provide services to an older adult is not going to try to cut off those relationships with family members or close friends. In fact, they would try to encourage them. And so that's one of the biggest things that I would say to watch out for when Adult Protective Services comes in to investigate that. Again, we're trying to see, where is the money, right? We try to get bank statements. We try to see what receipts are lying around. What is the money being used for? So, for example, if we found that this new best friend just got a brand new car, whereas before they were saying, I have nowhere to live. Can I come stay with you? Well, where is this money coming from, right? And a lot of the times, the abuser will, um, I guess, make themselves to be the only person that the older adult can rely on. So, of course, they're going to open up their homes to them. Of course, they're going to buy them the new car or whatever it is that they ask for.
In that vein, when we consider child abuse, the term that's used is grooming. Is that same terminology used for older adults?
Um, the term would be more just not so much grooming in that instance, but undue influence.
So, this idea of essentially cutting off relationships and resources from previously trusted others in order to kind of proceed with secrecy and take over and coerce the older adult into decisions that they wouldn't have otherwise made.
Exactly. And the other thing about that is that at the beginning of the relationship, this person seems very nice, very friendly, but as the relationship progresses, they may be more and more abusive. And this doesn't always happen, but we do see that happen often, where the abuser will then start calling the older person names, making their self-esteem really go down a lot. So that's something that's also very common for us to see.
Thank you. Stepping outside of the financial abuse realm and looking at some of these others, will you dive in wherever you see fit and where you'd like to start outside of financial abuse?
So let's talk a little bit about, let's go into neglect. So, neglect is the failure to provide essential services to an older or disabled adult. So, indicators of neglect might be poor hygiene, changes in medical care, whereas the older adult might have been going to their doctor's appointments as scheduled without a problem, and then they stop attending those medical appointments. They might also have not enough supervision. So, for somebody that might have dementia, needs to be supervised 24/7, that might not be happening. Another common indicator of neglect is having bed sores. However, I do want to mention something about bed sores. Bed sores can be normal. So, people, even in hospitals or skilled nursing facilities with the best possible care, can still get bed sores. So, it's not the only indicator, but if you are seeing bed sores along with a lot of other indicators, such as a filthy home, not having enough food or water, not getting to their medical appointments on time, it can be an indicator. And the other thing that I would like to say about neglect is that neglect can be intentional or unintentional. And what we see a lot of the times is that family members or friends or whoever that person's support system is, they really are trying to help the person, but they might not have the experience, education, or ability to provide the care that's needed. Some people really do need a lot of hands-on care, right? So if a spouse, for example, if the wife is maybe 100 pounds and very frail, and she's trying to provide care for her husband who's 250 pounds and he requires help with getting on and off the toilet, that might not happen just because she's not physically able to provide that care. So that is actually considered neglect, but we would look at that very differently than someone who is intentionally neglectful. So when we are addressing that, we would provide a lot more support services to the caregiver as well, just to make sure that they get the assistance that they need, that they get the education or just support that they need to be a good caregiver to that person.
Thank you for bringing up that point. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. Access to care is such a big issue for many communities and for older adults, often on fixed income, limited income, if any, in some situations. The cost for many medical services, or we'll say in home support services, can be exorbitant, may or may not be covered by various health insurance companies, for example. What happens in the situation that you just gave, let's say, where there are not financial means available to hire in home care, that the family doesn't have the benefits or affluence to hire somebody or move into a facility? Like, how does the system address that? Because I can see that happening pretty often.
And it does happen very often. It's really unfortunate that there really isn't a great answer for that. We try to get creative as much as we can. So we will ask, are there any family members out of state that might be able to either come and move in with you or that you can move in with elsewhere? Um, are there any other informal support systems, maybe a neighbor that can go get groceries for you or take you to your doctor's appointments? Um, Unfortunately, the system is not set up and it's not equipped to handle the ever growing population of older adults in this country. We see that all the time, and we just really have to get as creative as we can, which is really sad to say, but there is no great fix a lot of the times. And it's a lot of the times it's basically just making the situation a little bit better.
Okay, thank you. Um, Follow up question for that. So you mentioned, let's say, an adult child who's out of state. This is a question that I've heard asked before. Um, I had a recent conversation with a colleague about estrangement, that we have adults who do not have perhaps any relationship with older family members, and those older family members may be in need of care and may be in situations where they are experiencing, let's say, self neglect. Do those estranged family members have any legal obligation to that older adult?
Great question. No. Short answer is no. Adults do not have any legal obligation to provide care or assistance to their parents or older family members. What we see a lot of the times in those cases where the adult children are estranged is that there may have been child abuse that was going on when the now adult children were younger. So they don't want to have that relationship with them. And it's not our place to force them to do that. We do try to explore what each party wants to do. So, for example, does the older adult want us to reach out to those children? A lot of the times they'll say no, and we do have to respect what their wishes are. Um, and yeah, so they have no legal obligation to do so.
Out of curiosity, how far does APS typically go in trying to rally resources, knowing that that's a primary function here is to try to, as you said, make things better? So, like the example of an adult who lives out of state, are you the one making those calls? Is APS making those calls to say, hey, I'm calling about your dad?
So it is very much driven by what the client wants to do. Um, yes, if the client is all for it and they said, yes, I want my daughter to be involved. I've just been too ashamed to call her, or I don't want to bother her. That's another really common thing that we see. They don't want to be a burden to their adult children. We do try to um, get them to change their point of view, or we try to get them to just commit to a trial period sometimes. Um, so if the older adult wants us to reach out, we absolutely will make that call.
Got it. Thank you. Going back to different types of elder abuse. Next.
Okay, so that was neglect. Let's talk a little bit about physical abuse. Pretty self explanatory. Any kind of physical force that might result in bodily injury, physical pain, sexual abuse is also included. Sexual abuse is any non consensual contact, sexual contact of any kind. So, some of those indicators for physical abuse might be bruises, cuts, sprains, a history of injuries, frequent hospital or ER visits. And again, any changes in the person's behavior, going back to that. So, does the person seem particularly afraid of a specific person? Or does their behavior radically change when that person enters the room or when the topic of that person comes up? So, those are definitely some signs to look for. I would also look for explanations for injuries that don't seem quite right. So, if someone has no issues with their mobility and yet they seem to be falling down a lot, I would ask a little bit more about that. And again, if that person just does not want to discuss it, I think even with that, that would be reasonable suspicion to go ahead and just make that report.
When it comes to physical abuse, this is one of those topics that comes up with, I think, a little bit of confusion or concern within the clinical community about, like, do I ask to see wounds? Like that's something that comes up in the self harm community of, like, do I ask to see where they've hurt themselves? Like, what if it's in places that are private parts? Like, this is again kind of that territory of, like, clinicians may not know how to proceed. If a clinician has a reasonable suspicion of physical elder abuse, does it help APS if the clinician leans in and says, oh, I noticed when you sat down, you winced a little bit. Can you tell me what's going on? And then can you show me? Like, or is that like, no, APS takes care of it. We got this.
So, a lot of the times it is helpful for us to have additional evidence. Eventually, if we do find that abuse is confirmed, we are cross reporting that to law enforcement, and law enforcement is all about the evidence. So, any kind of pictures or detailed reports that we can get, the better. With that being said, no, it is not a clinician's job to get pictures of everything. If it's helpful and appropriate, I would say go ahead and do that if the older adult is okay with it. But for example, an injury to the genital area, probably not going to happen, right? So we don't need pictures of that. The other thing about injuries is that sometimes it takes a little while for APS to get out there and do their investigation. So if we are able to get pictures maybe the day after something happens, that can absolutely help a lot. And even if you can't get pictures, just detailed information about the injuries. Did they seek medical attention? That's another big question. And then later, APS can follow up and get those medical records. So anything that, again, the client feels comfortable with, it always really goes down to what does the client feel comfortable with?
Thank you. This question is a bit of a jump, so stay with me, and I want to cover this before I get lost in the other things I want to ask you about. Can you speak a little bit about suspicion of elder abuse coming up in therapy, not with that elder? So, someone saying, "Oh, I went to visit my great aunt, and she's in a facility, and she was covered in bruises. And she had told me that she didn't know she had money to stay there," which is weird because I thought I knew her finances and that there was a lot of money that she could use. And I'm just worried about her. Talk to me about that, where it's kind of, it's not direct, it's coming from another source.
Yeah, so we do get those reports quite often where it's coming from a therapist that hears it secondhand. And again, reasonable suspicion. That sounds like it's something that could potentially happen. So we would absolutely look into that. It's very helpful for the clinician to get details about the older adult. So obviously their name, date of birth, their current location, and just any other details that the person can provide can be very, very helpful. Um, I'm not sure about other jurisdictions because every APS program operates differently, but here in San Diego, we have even taken some reports that don't have a name. So we show up at a house and we say, "Hi, is there an 80-year-old woman living here? Can we talk to her?" So it really depends on the jurisdiction, but sometimes we can even take those with very limited information.
In the example you just gave, that particular example assumes that the therapeutic client who mentions this has concern and is not the one perpetuating the abuse. So let's flip it up a little bit and change it. That you're seeing an adult in therapy and the adult says, "Oh, I've been seeing my dad a lot and he bought me a new car and that was so much fun and it was really nice of him." And from prior conversations with this client that that older adult is not of capacity and cognitive ability to have consented to that purchase, let's say. So the client is the one that's perpetuating financial abuse. If we as clinicians go, "Hey, so can you tell me the name and the date of birth and the address of your parent?" That's where clinicians go, "Uh oh." If a clinician calls APS, they have to provide some information. So then they're providing the information of their client. And then does APS then try to figure out who is this person's parent? I'm just curious. I know these are examples, but I think these are the kind of things that I know for me in clinical practice, I go, what do I do?
Right. That's actually one that we don't see as often. And I think because people who know what they're doing are not going to be disclosing this. But so we do see that a lot less often. However, if that person is really just not aware that they could potentially be perpetrating elder abuse, I think it's really important to educate the client and let them know, hey, maybe you should check out this information on elder abuse. Does that sound like something that might be going on? Because the reality is, not a lot of people are very aware of elder abuse. Like child abuse, okay, they have an idea, but elder abuse is not talked about as often. So somebody might be perpetrating elder abuse and not even really know it. So the first step is just to make them aware. And in order to do that, a clinician must have at least a, a general idea of what elder abuse is. But there are other resources available to help with that. Or, if the clinician doesn't feel comfortable with educating that person about elder abuse, use the resources. Send them to the National Adult Protective Services Association and have them read up on elder abuse and then process together. Does this sound like it applies to you? And then they can kind of start working on okay, well, do they want to make a change? And if possible, still get contact information for that older adult, even if it's just a name and an address.
Thank you. I appreciate you addressing that hypothetical. I know that these situations can get complicated really easily. Can you speak a little bit about the idea of self neglect? Because this is one that I feel like comes up more often than I think we're probably aware. I know I've had it come up in clinical practice, um, because that line feels opaque. Where is the line where someone becomes unable to take care of themselves? And then we, as loved ones, are not stepping in enough to help them stay safe.
There really isn't a hard line. It's all very muddy. What we look for when we're talking about self neglect, first of all, is this a change in behavior? We receive a lot of referrals for people who are living in squalor, people who are living in hoarded homes, who are just not taking care of themselves. And sometimes that's just a lifestyle. They have been living that way for their entire lives. APS's role in those situations is to make them aware of resources that are out there if they ever want to make a change. But again, we are going off of what the client wants to do. So if they don't want to make a change because this is the way that they've been living their entire lives and they see nothing wrong with it, there really isn't much that we can do. And I really want to stress this because it is very, very different than child protective services. Adult protective services is a voluntary program. We have zero authority to remove people from their homes, to force anyone to take action or to stop any action. We are very limited as far as what we can do to step in. If a situation is very dire, we're going to be calling law enforcement. So that is another huge concept that is very different than when you're working with children, because children don't have the same rights as adults, right? And adults have the right to make their own decisions, even if they're very poor decisions, as long as they're understanding what they're doing, what the consequences might be. They can be free to continue to engage in that behavior that's putting them at risk. It's APS's job to go out and determine, does this person actually understand the consequences of their actions, and provide them with as many resources as they can. We also see this a lot with domestic violence situations. So couples may have been in an abusive relationship the entirety of their lives or their adult lives. And now they've hit that point where they're 60 years old. So now it's considered elder abuse. We go out, we meet with them. They, obviously are aware of the situation because they've been living it the majority of their adult lives. And a lot of the times they will decide not to take any action. And APS has to respect that. All we can do is start the conversation and try to get them thinking about, what if? What if there's a possibility of me living without abuse? What if there are other resources out there to help me? What if I can change my situation? And to just start planting that seed and start having that conversation to try to get them to see a different point of view.
I think the point that you made about APS and involvement with APS being voluntary is a really important one. That said, I would also anticipate that someone showing up with a name badge, on your doorstep, knocking on the door and saying, "I'm here to help you," even in the public, may not understand kind of what interventions are possible. The point you made about we can refer to law enforcement, but ultimately, if you tell us to leave, we're going to leave, I think is a good one to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a clinician making a report, or really any mandated report or making a report, I can see how that's very frustrating when you make a report, especially if it's the same person that you're making multiple reports on because nothing is happening. It is important to understand that point about the client's right to self determination. And it's not that APS doesn't want to do anything, it's because we must. we really have to respect the client's right to self-determination.
We've talked a bit about financial abuse, about self neglect, about neglect. You've talked a bit about physical. Talk to me about other kinds of abuse that may occur with elders.
Yeah, another one is isolation. This one we don't see as often as the other ones because, for the most part, older adults are able to still answer their phones, get their mail, go out and visit friends and family members. The times where we see isolation happening more are with adults who are not able to do those things. So they might be bedridden, right? So they're not able to have contact with the outside world without someone's help. So isolation is the intentional act that prevents a person from communicating with others, whether it's not allowing them to have visitors, not allowing them to receive or send mail, um, restricting their access to the phone, things like that. The other one that, again, we don't see as often is abduction. So, abduction is the malicious taking or enticing away from this. In California, it's from the state of California. And again, that might vary throughout different jurisdictions, but in the state of California, it's removing someone from the state. Again, we don't see this very often at all, but those are the major um, types of abuse. The other one that is a type of abuse, but not a penal code violation in the state of California, is mental suffering. So, mental suffering is pretty much anything that causes uh, the older adult to be intimidated or afraid. This could be threats, harassment, any kind of misleading statements that can cause emotional distress or agitation, anything that causes the person to fear or be confused is considered mental suffering. And with mental suffering, for the most part, we see this in combination with other forms of abuse. So we do see it occasionally on its own, but more commonly, it's co occurring with other types of abuse.
Physical abuse can sometimes, well, any of these kinds of abuse, but physical abuse can sometimes also involve sexual abuse. What separates out sex abuse with older adults from the standard sex abuse training that many clinicians have gotten about children? Like, what are the main differences? Like, how common is it for older adults to experience sex abuse, and what are some of the differences or nuances that we should be paying attention to?
That's a really good question. There is a lot of overlap between you know children sexual abuse and older adult sexual abuse as far as what it entails, right? So it can be any kind of inappropriate touching or sexual contact. The thing that makes sexual abuse with older adults a little bit different is that you can also see that as part of a caregiver's regular duties. So let me give an example of that. If a caregiver's regular duties are to change an older adult's diaper, there can be some inappropriate touching that can be passed off as, well, I was just changing them, and this is something that I have to do. In APS, what we're seeing is, or what we're investigating is, was this actually a necessary act? So, for example, I've gotten reports on people receiving enemas, right? So then, as APS investigating, we have to go back and ask, okay, who is the doctor? Is there a medical necessity for this? And if not, then we're going to consider that to be sexual abuse. That's really one of the biggest differences that we see. But, we still see sexual abuse occurring with older adults as a form of control and intimidation, right? So, same thing with children, it's a form of control. Um, we also see this fairly often, again, with couples who have been in abusive relationships for a very long time. So, the majority of their adult lives. And now it just happens to be that they meet the age criteria to be an older adult. Now it's considered elder abuse, but their spouse or partner may have been abusing them sexually for a long time. The other thing that we see, and it may or may not be similar with children, I really don't know, but there is a lot of shame and stigma around reporting abuse with older adults. So, older adults usually come from a generation where sometimes sex is taboo. You don't talk about sex, you don't talk about what happens. So, it can be very difficult to get them to open up and disclose what's happening.
In a case where it comes to your attention, APS, so let's say a clinician has filed a report and it is substantiated that this older adult has experienced some type of sexual abuse, APS is referring out to law enforcement, I assume, for investigation about that. And then what kind of services or intervention does APS usually provide to that older adult?
Yeah, so we often refer to, in California, we have as a part of the district attorney's office, we have victim advocates. So victim advocates can connect to victims of any kind of abuse, really, to therapy, and that's provided for free. We can connect them to other support systems to come in and fill the gaps. So, what we see a lot of the times is that the abuser, whether it's sexual abuse or really any type of other abuse, that person was acting as the caregiver for the older adult. And if they're arrested, now who's going to provide that care? So that's where APS steps in and helps them figure out, are they eligible for any programs? Do they have any other family members, friends, or other support systems that could come in to fill those gaps? Does the older adult need to move somewhere? So that's where APS comes in, and we try to help fill that gap and help them figure out how they're going to recover from this and move on with their lives. So whether that's through therapy, relocation, connecting with other support systems, whatever that is, that's what we try to help do.
Thank you. One thing we haven't talked about so far is prevalence. Around what percentage of older adults self identify that they have experienced some type of elder abuse?
That's a very low percentage. I don't recall off the top of my head what that percentage is, but it is probably not over 30%. There is a lot of shame when it comes to elder abuse, any type of abuse, with older adults. And I think one of the main reasons for that is that the majority of the time, maybe about 75% of the time, abusers are family members or close friends that they consider to be family members, right? And then you get the family dynamics that play into the situation, right? So if it's an adult son or daughter, there is a lot of shame about the older adult not raising them well. Or why did my kids turn out this way? And of course, they're not going to want to disclose that that abuse is happening. In the case of financial abuse and scams, there's shame about, how could I have fallen for this? I thought that I was smarter, or I thought that I was whatever, fill in the blank. So there is so much shame with reporting. And again, people don't talk about elder abuse. So it's not like everybody sharing their abuse stories at the senior center. Um, it's a very low number.
Thank you. With the limited time we have left, I have another question for you. As someone who specializes in working with this population, also supporting this population, you've already named some resources that I think are really helpful. Speaking broadly, what do you feel like are some of the most common mistakes that clinicians make when it relates to elder abuse?
One of the things that I see most often is clinicians who try to pressure the older adult to change their situation, to kick out the adult son who's been living with them rent free their entire lives without contributing financially. Um, as a clinician, we are trying to help people, and a lot of the times, trying to push them into action is something that is kind of our first instinct. However, I think what that does is it harms the therapeutic relationship because now it becomes adversarial, right? The older adult does not want to kick that person out because there's a lot of factors involved with that. That person might be their only support system. They might be the only person going out to get groceries for them or taking them to medical appointments. They're still family members. So there are a lot of feelings and family dynamics that are involved in that. So pushing the older adult to any kind of action, I would say, is something not to do. The best thing to do to support someone who is experiencing abuse or neglect, I think, is just to listen to them non-judgmentally. It is going to be important to make them aware of reporting requirements because they might disclose that there's abuse or neglect going on, and just being very transparent with them and emphasizing the fact that APS is voluntary, that the control is always in that person's hands. So APS is never going to do anything that that person does not want to do unless it's, something that we have to do, such as reporting to law enforcement. And even then, it's really up to that person to even talk to law enforcement. So just emphasizing that nothing is going to happen without their consent, and that the clinician is there to support whatever decision that older adult wants to make, as long as they are safe in doing so. So another thing that might be helpful is safety planning, especially in physical abuse situations, just helping that person be as safe as possible in their situation.
That was such thoughtful advice. I really appreciate what you just said, because I think you're right. Um, People who work in this field are often so called because we want to help people. And so to potentially care about a client and see that they're in a situation that may be hurting them, where it's like, well, let's change it. But I really appreciate what you're saying of kind of this foundational value of an individual's right to self-determination. I think there's so much more to be discussed on this topic, and I know I only have an hour. For people who are listening and really want to learn more about the process, about what happens with adult protective services, some of the intricacies of elder abuse, what resources do you recommend?
Yeah, so there is a National Adult Protective Services Association. I would also say reach out to your local APS program. There is an APS program in every part of the state. It's a mandated program, and I am hopeful that they are willing to educate on elder abuse and to have that conversation about what happens behind the scenes. Um, so the Adult Protective Services Association has a lot of information about what constitutes elder abuse, what APS reporters need to know, what might happen afterwards. So I would say that that's a good place to start.
Thank you. Part of this conversation is, of course, documentation. How are we documenting these incidents, the calls that we make? One of the things that I've heard clinicians say, and I want to ask this before we close today, is, can I call to ask if something is reportable?
Absolutely. So whenever there is a question and you're not sure if something is reportable, the call centers are very good about taking in the information that the reporters are giving and then letting them know, yeah, this sounds like this is something that's reportable. We'll go ahead and take that report. Or, that doesn't sound like there's any abuse or neglect going on, but let me provide you with these other resources. We do occasionally get people who are very proactive, and they're calling because something doesn't feel right, but nothing has happened yet. And unfortunately, APS is not able to take those reports, but it is good to just make the call, and they might be able to receive some extra resources or support from somewhere else.
Thank you. And one thing I'll note as the uh, resident documentation nerd, it's always my recommendation when a clinician makes those calls to document: who did you call, who did you speak with, what number did you use, what date, what advice were you given? Just because the day could come that chart may be used to reference, here are the steps that were made and the decisions that I made clinically. Penny, you are a wealth of information. You have covered so much content today. For people who want to learn more about you and about your work, what's the best way to do that?
So you can reach me at my website, which is www.pennyjacobo.net. That's PENNYJACOBO.net.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for taking some time out and joining us today. This has been a really eye-opening and helpful conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive continuing ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.